Good evening, and welcome to the final event of our conference, Is Christianity Natural? Of Evolutionary and Cognitive Science Perspectives. I'm going to say a few words to introduce both the program and our featured speakers tonight. For those of you who haven't been part of our discussion already, this conference is the capstone event of a 3-year project devoted to asking questions about the interface between Christianity and the cognitive science of religion. Led by Justin Barrett, the project gathered about 15 or 16 early and mid-career Christian scholars who were interested in the topic and approached it from multiple disciplinary perspectives, especially psychology and philosophy. For 2 summers, the scholars gathered to study the problem, refine their research questions, and we heard their papers earlier today. The project is made possible by collaboration between 3 institutions. The M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust provided generous funding, and special thanks to Steve Moore and Dana Miller for their vision and support. Calvin College's Seminars in Christian Scholarship has provided excellent hosting and organizational support, with special thanks to Mary Bennett and Joel Carpenter. And Seattle Pacific University has provided facilities and publicity support, with special thanks to John Glancy of the Graduate Center. Now, last night featured a really splendid lecture by tonight's respondent, Dr. Bob McCauley, who is the William Rand Kenan Jr. University Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture at Emory University. Bob comes to us with an impressive list of scholarly publications in philosophy, religion, anthropology, psychology, and cognitive science. His lecture last night, I thought, gave us a true glimpse into how rich insight can come when you combine perspectives from multiple disciplines. Specifically, the lecture gave us a glimpse into some of the key findings of his book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. For those of you who missed the lecture, you really should buy this book, or at least read this book. I guarantee it will be enormously thought-provoking and will change how you think about human religiosity. Our lecturer tonight is Justin Barrett, who recently moved from Oxford University to become the Thrive Professor of Developmental Science and Director of the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller Theological Seminary. His first book, Why Would Anyone Believe in God?, got a lot of attention because it argued that belief in God is a natural evolutionary development, but then argued that this makes perfect sense if you're a Calvinist. His most recent book is Born Believers, The Science of Children's Religious Belief, and here tonight speak to us on how to train your dragon, a Christian response to cognitive science of religion. So please welcome Justin Barrett.
Thanks, Mike. Let me turn on the mic here. One little just announcement, because there have been so many really good papers in this area that I want you all to be aware of, is that the John Templeton Foundation is running a competition, a grant competition on Minds and Gods is the title, and really it's cognitive approaches to the study of God concepts and related religious concepts. The deadline for their online funding inquiries, which are the very short sort of preliminary approach, is coming up. I believe it's at the very beginning of October, so we are getting very close, but there's still time if you've got a good idea in that area. And some of you, it's pretty obvious from the day's presentations, have some very good ideas in this area. I too want to thank Joel Carpenter and the Calvin Summer Seminars in Christian Scholarship, and Mike Hamilton and Seattle Pacific University for hosting this day, and the Murdoch Trust for making it possible. And I'll tell you, I've just been really gratified by the papers that I've heard. When we started this project, the impetus was to try to get Christian scholars to better engage the cognitive science of religion, because I was lonely, frankly. Okay, that was part of it, but a big part of it is I think there's so much potential for a mature Christian engagement with this area of science. And let's face it, as a community, Christians are kind of known for being a little bit anti-science and anti-intellectual sometimes. Maybe especially when it comes to the scientific study of religion. But there's a real opportunity here, and that's the topic of my presentation. We've all worked hard, so we're going to have a little bit of fun with this one. And I'm going to try to keep the surprises fairly minimal, but hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm doing here. So my title is How to Train Your Dragon, a Christian Response to Cognitive Science of Religion. DreamWorks' animated film, How to Train Your Dragon, appeared in 2010. It boasted $500 million in box office revenues and 2 Academy Award nominations. The film begins with this voiceover. This is Burke. It's 12 days north of hopeless and a few degrees south of freezing to death. It's located solidly on the meridian of misery. My village. In a word, sturdy. It's been here for 7 generations, but every single building is new. We have fishing, hunting, and a charming view of the sunset. The only problems are the pests. You see, most places have mice or mosquitoes. We have dragons. So the plot, if you haven't seen the film, revolves around a Viking community that is at perpetual war with various species of dragons. The dragons poach the Vikings' sheep, their fishing catches, and they burn the Vikings' homes. We learn that in just this small village, in 7 generations, dragons have killed hundreds of Vikings. Every young Viking is taught about dragons. For instance, in a representative page from their dragon manual, the film's hero reads, Thunderdrum. This reclusive dragon inhabits sea caves and dark tide pools. When startled, the Thunderdrum produces a concussive sound that can kill a man at close range. Extremely dangerous, kill on sight. Because they are so menacing and threatening to the Viking way of life, or even their very lives, the standard approach to all dragons is to kill on sight. In short, Vikings and dragons are mortal enemies at perpetual war. The hero of the film is an adolescent Viking named Hiccup. Hiccup is an inventor with a curious mind. He can't rely on his brawn, so he uses his intellectual gifts to build a weapon to bring down a Night Fury, the most feared dragon of them all. But instead of killing the Night Fury, he actually develops a relationship with it. He gets to know it and learn about it. And through their developing relationship, he discovers that, and I quote, everything we know about dragons is wrong, unquote. The Vikings and dragons can live and flourish together if the Vikings stop fearing and attacking the dragons and start learning what they really are, what motivates them. By working together, as the film unfolds, some of the dragons and some of the Vikings manage to liberate both communities from a collective curse. Hiccup discovers that the dragons had been attacking the Vikings because they had been forced into service of one enormous monster. Let's see, and I think that's here. Let's see. This guy, that big scary thing. And you see the scale. This is a regular sized dragon. And that's a wing going up there, and this is a big scary thing. Okay? Free of that monster, Vikings and humans can work together and live together and enhance each other's lives. For many Christians, different scientific schools or orientations are their dragons. These monsters are too dangerous to their way of life and must be killed on sight. The cognitive science of religion, or CSR, is among these dragons. But also, as in the film, it isn't the cognitive science of religion itself that is the problem. It may actually present assets for Christians. But the unhealthy relationship is spawned by some of the cognitive sciences and CSR themselves being conscripted exclusively into the service of genuine antithetical worldviews and agenda. The result is fear, suspicion, and even hostility. In the film, the enmity is diffused when one Viking gets to know intimately one specific dragon. I propose that we have been already doing something similar, something that we're seeing the fruit of in today's presentations. But this is just the beginning. We've been getting to know the CSR dragon very well, and learning better its true challenges as well as its true promise for Christian scholarship. An attempt to scientifically account for patterns of cultural expression that are often deemed religious by appealing to the operations of underlying cognitive systems. That's a shorthand for what cognitive science of religion is all about. And I know we've all heard that, but the people on the camera haven't. So I've got to say some of these things. That is, CSR attempts to understand why religious beliefs and practices survive and spread as they do by taking seriously the psychological dynamics at play in cultural environments. CSR's pedigree chart includes comparative religion, anthropology, developmental psychology, evolutionary psychology, and cognitive psychology, among others. They allow some philosophers in the door, too. But speaking as a Christian cognitive scientist of religion, my view is that most, if not all, of the alleged tensions between Christianity and cognitive science of religion are more a function of perception than reality. For the sake of time, I will not defend the view that modern science is generally compatible with Christianity. I'm convinced that in general it is. Despite the efforts of historians of science, such as John Hedley Brooke and Peter Harrison, it appears that few Christians, let alone non-Christians, recognize that the foundations of modern science include some assumptions imported or adapted from Christian theology. For those interested, Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion, and Naturalism, neatly summarizes some of these foundational principles, and in doing so shows science-suspicious religious folk that science may be more of a prodigal son than an arch nemesis. CSR draws heavily from evolutionary psychology and anthropology, and I will also assume, rather than defend, that some version of Darwinism is compatible with Christianity and a view of Scripture as authoritative. Let me instead turn to a handful of concerns that I hear Christians raise regarding CSR when I'm peddling it around, and argue that the menace of these fears is more perceived than real. All right, we'll start with this one. Reductionism. Reductionism is a boogeyman in Christian circles these days, it seems. My Apple dictionary actually defines reductionism this way. Noun, often derogatory. Really, it says that. It really says that. The practice of analyzing and describing a complex phenomena, especially a mental, social, or biological phenomena, in terms of phenomena that are held to represent a simpler or more fundamental level, especially when this is said to provide a sufficient explanation. But analyzing complex phenomena in terms of their constituent parts is an approach common in the sciences. And to me, at least, it's not clear that there's anything wrong with that. And we can think about this in practical domains as well. So for instance, why did my car stop working? How am I going to account for that? Well, because maybe a crack in my oil pan led to losing oil, which led to poor lubrication of moving parts, leading to overheating and the engine locking up. Okay? We analyze the wholes, the car, in terms of constituent parts to better understand what is going on with the whole. And at least by itself, it doesn't seem to me that there's anything evil, sinister, or anti-Christian about this sort of reductionism. The danger is not the methodological tactic of reduction, but the metaphysical move of concluding that one level of explanation is entirely reducible to another level, and hence the level that has been reduced is meaningless or unreal, and is thus eliminated. And I've been influenced in this kind of thinking, thanks to actually Bob McCauley, in introducing to me the distinction between reductionism and reductive eliminativism. I think you use terms like that, or have in the past, roughly, but he can sort me out later. As a science, CSR practices reductionism. It attempts to understand cultural or religious level phenomena by looking downstairs at the foundational psychological dynamics. But in doing so, it need not conclude that the cultural level is suddenly irrelevant, causally impotent, or fictive. When a scientist makes this eliminative move in the name of parsimony or Occam's razor, defenders of the cultural or religious level are right to call foul. It's not a necessary move. Further, Christians are concerned that describing the dynamics that lead to religious beliefs and practices in terms of cognitive dynamics somehow eliminates the reality of God or other supernatural entities. Though some cognitive scientists of religion appear to believe that CSR does just this job, this assumption is not appreciably different than studying the psychology of why it is that we believe that others have mental states and then concluding that others do not have mental states on that basis. Or studying the psychology of maternal love and concluding that mothers do not actually love their children. Some cognitive scientists do want to make this eliminativist move, but others, including Professor McCauley, have rightly fought against it. Naturalism. CSR employs a sort of methodological naturalism. That is, when it comes to explaining religious thought and behavior, we try to see how far we can understand and explain without positing the existence of supernatural entities or forces. Here, methodological naturalism does not assume that there are no gods, ghosts, ancestors, etc., but we remain agnostic about whether there are and see how far we can go without making metaphysical commitments one way or the other. For instance, one reason that ritual systems that propitiate spirits have developed and persist could be that spirits are real, and failing to develop such systems, ritual systems, creates selective pressure against individuals and groups without such rituals. If you don't make the spirits happy, they will whack you, and that's bad for you. The ritual performers then tend to outsurvive and reproduce the ritual non-performers. Okay, so that's one evolutionary account of rituals. It's not a naturalistic one. Such an account has not gained traction in CSR because it requires a particular commitment to the reality of spirits that not all CSR scholars share. In CSR, accounts of rituals tend to remain silent about whether or not spirits are real and whether or not they act in response to rituals. For instance, emphasizing the psychological dynamics that lead to ritualized behavior or group cohesion that collective rituals may produce, whether or not there are spirits or gods. Now, you may think that refusing to acknowledge supernatural realities is a serious limit on CSR, a limitation. And indeed it is. But it has the virtue of allowing a diversity of scholars from different worldviews and metaphysical commitments to collaborate and find explanations they can mutually endorse. Those explanations can then be augmented or amplified by specific religious communities, including Christians. So you can add in the gods later, if you like. As Professor McCauley said in the first night, no scientific explanation is ever complete. So there's room to do more, if you like. But we're starting with this methodological naturalism. And I don't think there's anything necessarily bad about that. Okay? One apparent point of conflict between Christianity and CSR is over the matter of teleology, or purposes in human life. Christianity traditionally affirms that humans exist to glorify God, to love God and love other people, to develop character, to care for creation, and so forth. All right? We have purposes that we are put on this world for. And traditionally, Christians who have engaged evolution have believed that evolutionary processes have a directionality to them that's pointed toward creatures like us, with self-awareness, some degree of rationality, moral culpability, and the like. Insofar as CSR draws from Darwinism, you might think that CSR rejects such a view, right? Well, not quite. I think as with certainly some in cognitive science of religion, cognitive scientists of religion would reject such a view. But as with naturalism, in the practice of doing CSR, teleological commitments largely are shelved for the most part, and the science attempts to go as far as it can without committing to some kind of evolutionary directionality, one way or the other. Now, I want to note interestingly that in recent years, evolutionary biologists are beginning to warm up to the idea of some kind of directionality in evolution. Famously, Cambridge's Simon Conway Morris has challenged Stephen Jay Gould's assertion that rerunning the evolutionary tape would lead to entirely different outcomes. Morris argues that evolution appears to have certain constraints that make sentient beings like ourselves almost inevitable. Jeff Schloss and others have also begun noting that evolution appears to move from less toward more cooperation or even altruism over the broad scope of evolutionary history. And while these debates are far from settled, I'm just throwing these up as examples, they show that the neighboring sciences from which CSR draws are not necessarily ateleological in their commitments. Okay, they may be different teleological. And presumably then, neither is CSR. That is, it's not necessarily ateleological. It just is methodologically so, I think. Okay. In his Atlantic Monthly article, and subsequently, Yale psychologist Paul Bloom got under the skin of many Christians by referring to God and religion as an accident of evolution. Surely here we have a genuine conflict between CSR and Christianity, right? I think really what we have is a poor rhetorical decision. By accident, Bloom means to draw attention to the idea that tendencies toward religious belief are a byproduct of evolutionary processes and not an adaptation in reaction to particular selection pressures. Accident is a poor word choice because, strictly speaking, from a naturalistic Darwinian perspective, all mutations and resulting phenotypes are accidental, as opposed to intentional or deliberate. So byproduct is the better term, I think. But even this irritates some Christians. What do you mean religion is a byproduct? That sounds bad, right? Sort of like a chemical byproduct or nuclear waste or something like that, right? And some smart people have sort of taken the bait on this. In the book I already mentioned, Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, I think he gets unnecessarily defensive about this term and expresses outrage over the idea that music could be an evolutionary byproduct, that somehow such labeling cheapens the cultural expression. But nothing of the sort is implied by the label byproduct. Many cognitive scientists of religion, myself included, talk about various religious phenomena as byproducts of evolution or byproducts of other cognitive systems. Byproduct here means nothing more than not an adaptation. As far as I can tell, Christian doctrine is silent with regard to whether belief in God could rise as an evolutionary byproduct versus an adaptation, versus some other means or combination thereof. But I'll let the theologians fill me in if there's something I'm missing there, right? A more recent kerfuffle has arisen over journalistic treatments of Will Gervais and Aaron Zion's recent article in Science that some of you heard about earlier, and similar papers by others. Cognitive scientists of religion, such as Professor McCauley and myself, have argued that natural cognitive predilections make religious thought and practice attractive to most people in most places throughout human history. Ordinary cognitive faculties produce religion-consistent intuitions. It is not misleading, then, to talk about folk religion, as opposed to theology, as being very intuitive. Well, it follows very easily from this observation that to resist the pull of religious intuitions may require engaging in certain kinds of reflective or analytical thought. And so, people more likely to engage in reflection or analytical thought are more likely to reject religious intuitions and thus become atheists or agnostics regarding religious entities. Note, however, that nothing directly follows from this observation regarding the truth of the positions in question. Many goods and ills, truths and falsehoods, are the product of reflective thought. Analytic thought can be good or bad, just as can intuitions. People thinking analytically are more likely to be, well, theologians, for instance, too. People thinking analytically and suppressing their intuitions are more likely to believe that reality is an illusion, that morality has no truths, that we are all brains in a vat somewhere. Those are reflective ideas, too. Okay, analytic thought, supported by certain social structures, has produced great scientific breakthroughs, but also major mistakes. Of course, the rhetorical power of saying analytic thinkers are more likely to be atheists is similar to noting, as has been done in a recent meta-analysis, that people 2 standard deviations above the mean in general intelligence have higher probability to be atheists. And that is a recent study, and I don't doubt that it's right. What I do doubt is that such an observation goes very far in deciding who is right about such things. Okay, Christians need not be afraid of CSR. The alleged conflicts are just that, alleged. Properly viewed, they are either trivial or, more often, metaphysical overlays from the scientists and non-scientists who work in the area and these are not central or non-negotiable parts of the scholarly enterprise. In fact, I think there are some more interesting points of convergence or concord between Christianity and CSR that are rarely observed. Anybody recognize this picture? Some of you who know the film? This one you might not recognize because the film has not come out yet. This is from the sequel that'll be coming out in, I think, May or June. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. We're very excited. Yep. More dragon movies. A friend at DreamWorks sent me this. He said, here, use this. I'm like, all right, that'll be fun. All right. Okay, I'll start with humble realism, what I'm going to call humble realism. And I know I'm going to get some of the philosophers bothered by this, but that's all right. You'll get my point. Just be charitable. The people in the blogosphere, they'll savage me enough. Okay. There are some exceptions, but by and large, Christian thinkers have been realists in their metaphysics, that there's a real world out there, including God, and we can say some things about that reality. The doctrine of creation, emphasizing that humans are not gods, but creatures, but are very special creatures with the capacity to seek and grasp truths about their world. And then the doctrine of the fall, that humans' rational capacities are compromised by sin, combine to lead many Christians to adopt what we might call humble realism. There's a real created world of which we are a part, and we can know things. But one of the things we know is our own limitations. Consequently, our pursuit of truths must be checked and rechecked, and maybe are always provisional to a certain extent. With others, we're checking against each other, we're checking against divine revelation and all kinds of other sources of knowing, okay? Now, in a parallel way, modern science seems to generally, or modern scientists, maybe we'll put it that way, since philosophers of science, who knows what they're up to, right? I mean, you can fill us in, it's hard to keep track. But generally, modern science affirms a real world and real knowing, but also recognizes the provisional nature of knowledge and that you kind of have to hold things loosely, all right? And that there's a need to systematically check and recheck and correct for human error. As Bob McCauley has expressed in his lecture last night, science is a socially distributed activity. It's a community activity because that distribution of tasks helps reduce the error of individuals working on their own. In some respects, then, assumptions of modern science about human knowing, in some respects, approximates common Christian views concerning human knowing. Okay? And I actually think, at least in my travels, when you get Christians and at least sort of the right sorts of scientists together, they actually have a lot more in common epistemologically than a lot of the anti-science folks in other disciplines, for instance, and in other worldviews. There's actually quite a bit of common ground that's, I think, often missed. Christians also typically affirm that the cosmos was created by divine will and is a contingent, not a necessary thing, with laws and features that could have been otherwise. Consequently, it is not possible to reach truths about the world by mere reflection or deduction. Empirical evidence, experientially exploring the world, is critical to learning and knowing from most Christian perspectives. Likewise, modern science is built on observation and not mere analysis. Okay, well, this one's a bit of a reach, and I know, it's going to irritate some people, but give it a chance, give it a chance. It seems to me that Christianity affirms a certain view of human nature that falls somewhere between the empiricist idea that we're all blank slates that can become anything we like depending upon experience, and the nativist idea that our character is fixed. I mean character in a very broad sense. I want to call this middle ground tempered nativism. Christian anthropology typically recognizes that humans as a group have certain capacities, as a group, as a species, if you will, that set them apart from other creatures for a specific role or purpose. And each human as an individual has a specific set of capacities and specific purposes. So we've got the collective that sets us apart from other creatures, and then we each have our own. That is, there are theological reasons to think humans have some kind of divinely appointed human nature. And each person has a particular individuating identity. Sometimes we call that a soul, without getting into funny things about minds and bodies and that sort of thing, all right? But Christian theology also emphasizes the flexibility of humans to transcend their natural state, to grow, to develop. In somewhat similar ways, CSR draws upon, disproportionately, I think, upon those psychological sciences that emphasize human distinctives from other animals, and a certain modest nativism with regard to development. Some traits are naturally going to emerge by virtue of being humans living in typical human environments. Some ways of thinking and behaving really are more natural than others. and even fairly radical social interventions will fail to erase these natural tendencies. Okay, we heard last night, practice naturalness will not absolutely wipe out maturationally natural tendencies. These natural tendencies encourage ways of thinking and acting that often manifest as religion. So says CSR, at least a lot of folks in CSR. Okay. Again, maybe a reach. I said that CSR tends to see how far it can go, assuming that human evolution and human life has no particular purpose or direction. So it can appear teleological. That said, as CSR has grown closer to evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology, it has begun to adopt those fields' tendency toward what one might call methodological teleology. Analogous to methodological naturalism, in which natural causal forces are bracketed as the only set under consideration, while remaining silent on metaphysical commitments, methodological teleology is the practice of operating as if evolution has a direction or purposes in mind for creatures, even while accepting that in a strict sense this may be false. And I got to see this up close and personal in the 5 years that I taught in the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at Oxford. For instance, a common strategy in evolutionary psychology, and to some extent increasingly in CSR, is to wonder what the purpose a current way of thinking or acting might have been good for in the past or in the present. What is it good for now? What's it good for? What problem did it solve? Okay, this is teleological ways of thinking, and it's a really helpful strategy. Sometimes it's called reverse engineering, right? And that appeal to engineering, of course, is an appeal to things with purposes. Many of you are familiar with Deb Kelman's work showing that trained scientists tend to reject teleological or functional reasons for natural phenomena at a rate higher than scientifically naive people, who tend to find such explanations very attractive from very early age. So statements such as, ferns grow in forests because they provide ground shade, are typically rejected by scientists as good explanations of why ferns grow in the forest. But I presented one of Kelman's published papers to a group of evolutionary anthropologists, and they objected that these weren't bad explanations, even in a slowed down mode. Okay? And they're not dumb. But what they were saying is that these are actually very helpful ways of thinking about natural phenomena in systems, in ecologies, from an evolutionary perspective. So my interpretation is they were saying that methodological teleology is a tool in the evolutionary scientist's kit. That Christians affirm human teleology on a metaphysical level should make it really easy for us to adopt this game and play it, okay? And use teleological thinking in a scientific setting, such as in CSR. We don't have to bracket it and put it on the shelf, as it were. Again, I'm not sure I'm committed to that view. I'm just trying stuff out, okay? Okay, religion is natural but not hardwired. I've been discussing assumptions and meta-theoretical sorts of commitments, but when it comes to finding, CSR and Christianity find another point of convergence. From some religious perspectives, whether one is a religious person or not could be the consequence of biological inheritance only. Okay, if you're not this race of people, you cannot be, say, Hindu, for instance. Some Hindus would argue. Special divine revelation or selection only. It's another way you could become religious, right? A God appointed you so, otherwise you're out of luck. Or special training or cultural conditions only. CSR and Christianity, typically, reject all three of these options. Okay? Many in CSR say that most all humans have natural dispositions that under normal circumstances will lead them to religious belief. But that the particulars of the religious beliefs and practices will be dependent upon individual and cultural factors. It seems Christianity has something similar in mind by stressing common grace and special revelation together with the value of scriptural and community contributions to faith development. Religion is natural, but it isn't fixed or determined. It isn't hardwired. To my mind, at least, the necessary conflict between CSR and Christianity is tiny in comparison to the concord. But the possibility of coexisting does not necessarily motivate a close working relationship. Why shouldn't Christians just let cognitive scientists of religion get on with their work? You know, and stay away from it. Just let them get on with it. Why should they care? Why should they get involved? Why are you all getting involved, those of you who are? Let me affirm you by concluding my remarks with just a few reasons why I think it could be valuable for Christians to engage with CSR in a mature way. So I'm just going to, I could have just stopped because I guess of what Mark McCauley said in this last presentation was really some great stuff. He said it in some ways better than I can. But I'll stumble through anyway. Okay. Look, cognitive developmental psychology is a constant resource, or at least should be, for improving education in the big world out there. The cognitive science of science, in particular, is providing new insights specifically for science education. They make cool discoveries and then figure out, all right, what does this mean for then teaching kids about science? Say about physics, or about evolution, or about chemistry. We should expect then that as the cognitive science of religion matures, it will provide useful information for religious education. Already, CSR has begun challenging older Piagetian models of childhood religious education and is providing pointers for what sorts of things will likely be easier or more difficult to teach and techniques for disseminating difficult theological material. Considering missions, missiologists are already finding inspiration from CSR. For instance, Brian Malley's book, How the Bible Works, and Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson's relevance theory of communication are challenging Bible translators to reconsider how to go about translating for relevance instead of for word meaning, and to consider how the Bible is used not just as a collection of texts, but as a sacred object. For instance, a doctoral student of intercultural studies at Fuller, who has worked for years with Bible translators in Papua New Guinea, reports that often people do not use the Bible in their vernacular even when it's available. So the Bible translators work hard, say, here's the Bible in your language. And they say thanks and put it on the shelf and then use it in a trade language or a regional language instead. One that they don't understand as well. Okay? Why is that? Well, I'm not going to answer that. But CSR may be a resource for answering just these kinds of questions. And I think some of the things that Brian Malley points to in his study of American Baptists in Ann Arbor, Michigan, actually provides insights into what the people are doing in Papua New Guinea. Okay? Likewise, these issues that missionaries face may encourage, going the other way around, may encourage CSR to turn to new topics as yet unstudied or understudied from a cognitive perspective. Maybe like how the Bible works or how Scripture is used. Okay? Further, Harvey Whitehouse's modes of religiosity seems to generate corollary predictions regarding the consequences of various modes of religiosity colliding, as happens in missionization. Bob McCauley and Tom Lawson's work on ritual forms seems to have implications for what might happen if missionaries attempt to stop certain classes of rituals from being practiced, instead of allowing indigenous peoples to transform their existing rituals. Their scholarship on rituals also seems to offer insights regarding the introduction of new rituals, elimination of old ones, or the transformation of rituals. For instance, it didn't surprise me some years ago when many churches of England withdrew the common cup from Holy Communion due to fears of an epidemic that as a consequence, parishioners regarded communion as importantly lacking something. Okay? Even when the leadership assured them that it was still Holy Communion, and that such a practice had precedent, in fact, hundreds of years of precedent. It didn't matter for the people sitting in the pew. Legality wasn't the issue. Sort of doctrinal authority was not the issue. But what was their intuitions regarding what happens when you remove the supernatural agent from this ritual. You took away God from the ritual in some respect. It doesn't matter if you tell me it's okay, because my psychology says it ain't. All right? But I think, actually, Lawson and McCauley's ritual form hypothesis provides resources that the Church of England could have used to anticipate this and maybe suppress a little bit of dissatisfaction with their decision. Okay. In addition to these sort of practical theological matters, CSR also has the potential to help Christians address theological questions, it seems to me. Not necessarily answer these questions. Theology can do a lot of this work on its own, but to bring new perspectives to bear on old debates, thereby renewing and refreshing them in some cases. For instance, Christian theologians have long wondered what capacities set off humans as special among existing animals, such that they're said to be created in God's image, the Imago Dei. Often the key capacity is linked to being able to love God and others in a personal, reciprocal way, Okay, that Karl Barth has championed this kind of idea. That is, whatever it is that makes humans imago Dei should be related to being religious, if religious has something to do with the relationship with God. Cognitive scientists of religion have long emphasized the importance of higher order theory of mind capacities. That are a critical capacity that makes religiousness natural, but also makes personal relationships with humans possible. Further still, it's been suggested that this higher order theory of mind is critical for certain types of moral culpability, and even for full-blown language acquisition and use, and cumulative culture too. If this thesis turns out to be incorrect, even if it does turn out to be incorrect, it illustrates the potential for CSR to contribute to theological issues, right? Okay, because the sciences are bringing, sort of casting a spotlight on certain kinds of capacities from a scientific perspective, knowing how they work to make humans what they are, okay? Similarly, in a paper I wrote with Kelly James Clark, I've argued that CSR may bear on the character of the sensus divinitatis, or sense of the divine, that's been postulated by Calvin, Augustine, and others, and has its roots in St. Paul's writings. The basic idea is that people naturally have faculties that incline them towards belief in the divine. Open questions, however, concern how strong the disposition is, how it develops, whether it is constantly generating theistic intuitions or whether it's only occasionally triggered. If it is occasionally triggered, when? How? What intuitions does it trigger? Do they specify the Abrahamic God, or just some kind of supernatural agent, or just some transcendent otherness? How vague or how specific? Insofar as these are questions about human psychology, they may be fruitfully addressed via CSR. Okay, last slide. Finally, Christians need to be engaged with CSR for apologetic reasons. As a community, it is too easy for us to be knee-jerk science phobes who retreat from new findings without first seeking to understand them. Being able to talk intelligently about this area, an area that is receiving play in popular science writings and in anti-religious polemics by new atheists, would go some way in protecting Christians from being branded anti-intellectual and anti-science. We cannot ignore the sciences, particularly the scientific study of religion. They're relevant to us personally. But further, it may be that CSR will uncover evidence that bears on past and present arguments in philosophy, religion, and apologetics. Some of our philosophical participants have been working on just these issues, and they shared about them today. And they're the real experts. But let me just for fun, allow me to raise just one such argument that Bob McCauley's excellent book, Why Religion is Natural and Science Isn't, prompts. Okay? It bears upon an argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, and has been forcefully developed and defended by Al Plantinga for the past 20 years. It's inspired by what is known as Darwin's doubt, the concern that evolution by natural selection does not appear to give sufficient grounds to trust our cognitive faculties as truth-giving devices. As Plantinga notes, this isn't just Darwin's doubt, but Nietzsche's, Thomas Nagel's, and Patricia Churchland's. Since Professor McCauley has published a book on the Churchlands, allow me to quote her. Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of the nervous system is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. That is, evolution selects for organisms with nervous systems that are tuned to survive, not necessarily know the truth. Plantinga argues that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable to deliver truth is low given evolution and naturalism, that is, that there is no God, and moves on to argue that believing both that there is no God and that evolution is true defeats one's justification to believe that evolution is true, because the faculties that deliver you that belief are not reliable to give you such a belief. Now, without trying to develop the argument in full or even necessarily defend it, let me observe a common objection goes along these lines. Look, if our human type of nervous system regularly developed false beliefs, such as whether there are predators or prey around, where the safe places to step are, what is good food and what isn't, we die off pretty quickly if it wasn't getting those things right. Okay, so our cognitive faculties must be reliable for at least those basic types of survival beliefs. Scientific beliefs, such as believing the truth of evolution by natural selection, are built up from those basic survival beliefs. They are therefore reliable as well. Okay, they sort of inherit that reliability. Now, Plantinga has worked hard to argue against the first part of this objection, that we must have basic beliefs that are largely veridical. So I won't say much about that other than to note that one line of defense he doesn't develop has actually been opened up by a few scholars who identify with CSR, including Ryan McKay and Dominic Johnson. The idea is error management in evolutionary systems. And the argument is that a strictly truth-aimed system will be outcompeted by a system that selectively weighs the consequences of error rather than treating all errors as equal. The result would be nervous systems that are very tolerant of low-risk errors and intolerant of high-risk errors. Okay? Error management then suggests another way in which a simple equation between true beliefs and fitness can't be drawn. But then there is McCauley's defense of Plantinga, as I will call it. Sorry, Bob. McCauley forcefully and convincingly argues in his book and last night against the idea that there's a simple extrapolation from basic survival beliefs, what I've been calling those, to scientific beliefs. Basic survival beliefs, including folk science, if you want to use that term, are natural. Modern scientific beliefs, such as that evolution is true, arise through relatively unnatural means. If McCauley is correct, and I give him the benefit of the doubt on this, one cannot simply argue that the alleged necessary reliability of our day-to-day beliefs grounds our scientific beliefs. I may have this wrong, okay? But my point is not to develop an argument as much as to illustrate that careful engagement with cognitive science of religion perhaps may bear apologetic fruit alongside theological and practical fruit for Christian thinkers. I don't know that it's going to persuade atheists, but it may provide comfort anyway in the face of conflict, as Myron Penner was trying to suggest. It might do more than that. I don't know. Much then as Hiccup and his fellow Vikings turned enemies into friends through better understanding and engagement, I urge Christian scholars to begin a long-term engagement with cognitive science of religion and its scientific cousins. Both Christianity and CSR stand to profit from the partnership. Thanks.
Okay. I'd just like to take a very brief moment to just thank you again for having me at this conference. I've had a great time and really enjoyed hearing all these papers today, which I found just utterly stimulating on multiple fronts. And I realize that's general, but I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to take a lot of time. Justin Barrett is an insider in two communities, and it seems to me he's spoken effectively about how that is a perfectly good situation to be in, and indeed how useful interaction between those two communities can be for both. As you'll see, I disagree with little that Justin has said. And where I do disagree with him, the disagreements are comparatively minor. Consequently, I will use, I'm probably, by the way, I'm not going to go for debate, which he ended his talk with. And in fact, he got my view right. Whether or not it defends and fits in the way he said, I will leave for you all to decide. But consequently, I want to use two of my 4 comments, namely the first one and the last one of the 4, on Justin's talk as an occasion for making a couple of further observations that I hope will contribute to our thinking about the issues that Justin has raised. Now, he raised a lot of issues. My first comment is really just a very quick little note as a philosopher of science. And that is, it is important to understand that, and Justin characterized the distinction exactly correctly. That is to say that, we always start pulling out our hands and making levels of analysis and levels of explanation in science, greater generality at the basis of the physical sciences. Physical sciences presumably describe all events. The biological science is a subset of those events. The psychological science is a subset of those events. And the sociocultural science is a subset of those events. Likewise, there's a, at least if we buy the best science we've got, that order is also reflects when these systems in questions emerged in natural history. But he's quite correct, I think. I've argued this actually at great length in a number of papers now, that there is no elimination when we move from sciences that look at a common phenomenon from, as it were, different levels of analysis, different grains. I think, in fact, there's virtually, other than at the very earliest stages, perhaps, of a few emerging sciences, there's really, when you're not quite yet clear about exactly where the science might fit, there's, I think, really no historical illustration of that at all. The reason that this issue arises is because there is confusion about this for the following reason, and that is, elimination does occur in science. There's no question about that. There's a scrap heap of scientific concepts that we don't use anymore, from phlogiston to caloric fluid to the luminiferous ether to the bodily humors and on and on and on. To the phrenological faculties, though they may be coming back. If you know anything about modularity theory. I mean, that's actually literally an analogy that Jerry Fodor starts his book Modularity of Mind with. The point is that eliminations, however, only occur in a particular science over time. So it's not this vertical relation, it's a horizontal relation over time in a science. Okay, that's the first comment. So indeed, Justin is quite right that they don't occur in the kinds of cross-scientific contexts that characterize the cognitive sciences generally and cognitive science of religion in particular. Okay, next quick comment, I hope. The hints of, the possible hints of teleology and biological evolution. Regarding Schloss, natural selection is always about selection forces that are imposed on organisms in various environments. The notion that there is evolution toward greater groupishness in our species seems correct, just as a kind of observation about what the trends look like, okay? But that is explicable on various possible grounds that do not necessarily reflect any underlying teleology or directionality to biological evolution. It could, for example, be more about the environments we're in and their comparative quiescence and stability, especially over the last 12,000 years. I mean, one thing you need to remember is that we've had cycles of ice ages that have looked like they've had some pretty serious impacts on lots of species, including our own. Global warming notwithstanding, we have no reason to think that at some point or other we'll be facing another. And in fact, if the averages go the way they look like they've gone over the last couple 100,000 years, we're within 3,000 years of one. The last time that was the case, as far down as Minnesota was covered in a mile-high mountain of ice. Okay? Canadians, come on down. Okay. Regarding Conway-Morris et al., it's true that there is great theoretical upheaval in contemporary evolutionary science, broadly construed, and that there isn't any question about that. And I think it just shows how lively and wonderful that science is, especially concerning issues surrounding genetic expression and about processes other than natural selection, for example, genetic drift, that have an impact on species phylogenies. However, I personally don't see any grounds for that, from that upheaval for drawing any conclusions that some do about underlying patterns in evolutionary processes yielding conclusions about what is, to quote, almost inevitable, end quote. I'd note that Justin stressed 4 slides later that on most Christian theologies, the universe is a contingent fact, not a necessary one. Now, I realize almost inevitable is not necessary, but we're certainly getting close, aren't we? So that's the first sort of mildly critical comment, or cautionary comment. It's not critical, not really, I guess. This is my second mildly cautionary comment. If I've understood him correctly, Justin, when he talks about what he calls methodological teleology, defends, in effect, adaptationalism in evolutionary thinking, and says, in effect, sort of evolutionary psychology does it, and so do lots of folks in CSR, in the cognitive science of religion. I think I made fairly clear last evening that, at least comparatively speaking, I'd position myself relatively more distant from that position. But I'd add, someone else who defends exactly this view, you might be interested to know if you don't, is Dan Dennett. There are, however, completely legitimate worries about adaptationalism run amok in evolutionary psychology. No adaptationalism without subsequent reverse engineering of the underlying mechanisms and careful research on the relevant ecological niches and the dynamics of the selection pressures at stake. That's a doctrine I've just enunciated there. How do you like that? Okay, my last comment, and that is, I'm hoping this will get people a little stirred up. I've been touched and truly flattered by the fact that so many of you have given some of my work such serious reading, and it is flattering. But mostly it's been my most recent book. And I'd like to actually call to your attention in precisely the spirit that Justin was describing about the potential fruitful interaction between cognitive science of religion and frankly even Christian theology as far as that goes, but certainly folks who are interested in Christianity at any number of levels. I want to talk a bit about, very quickly, about something that, a consequence of the theory of ritual that Tom Lawson and I have laid out, theory of ritual form. Because when we were writing our second book, Bringing Ritual to Mind, this is now sometime in the past. I mean, this book came out more than 10 years ago now. We started, indeed, as theoreticians, fairly high up in the sky, right? But thinking about some consequences of the hypothesis that we were advancing. And rather than taking you through all the details, because that'll take too much time, I deduced from the theory that one particular sort of ritual arrangement would be especially effective at winning, keeping, and inspiring participants in a religion. Okay? Now, as the cognitive science of religion sort of got on a roll, and among other things, the American Academy of Religion started sort of welcoming us and inviting us to do things. The very first talk in the series over a few years that occurred there, I sent to a room that was packed, as Justin, I think, probably remembers. I mean, out into the hallway. It was very nice. Probably a couple hundred people there. But, I said, this room full of religion scholars, do any of you know a religion that has a ritual like this? Okay? I haven't told you what the ritual's like yet, but that's not going to be the plea I'm going to make to you. I'm just going to offer a little sort of cautionary comment here. I spent a long time looking for an existing ritual that meets the conditions the theory specifies. And actually, I found it. That is to say, it wasn't somebody coming and saying, hey, check this one out, in what, lo and behold, is by many measures the fastest growing religion in the world. And, I mean, we all understand where we're at and who we are here. I'll give you news. It's not yours. Okay? It is, if you want to discuss the details of this, we can. I'm just going to drop this as a bomb, so to speak, to get folks excited, and I hope talking. And that is, it's the ritual of the baptism of the dead in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. On our theory, that ritual is just about perfect for doing the things that I've just said. Enlisting people, keeping them, and inspiring them. And one would, as we look at sort of the growth rates, and Rodney Stark has looked at the growth rates of the LDS Church, it would seem to suggest that we may have got our fingers on at least one of the mechanisms that may be involved there. I just offer that for you for pondering, and I hope you regard it as another kind of contribution, that thinking the way one of the communities Justin is involved in, and that now many of you are involved in, will have, I hope, an interesting and sort of fruitful contribution to thinking in the other community that you're in. Thanks.
We have about 20 minutes for questions, and so I'm going to hand Justin the handheld mic. Bob's still mic'd up. I'd ask them both to be available for questions. If you would direct your questions to the individual, that would be really helpful. So, and then I'll referee as we go. So, questions.
They're all tired. Looking
Good. Yeah.
This is for Bob. You're going to drop that bomb on us with some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, and I think a remark that you made earlier today about people's conceptions of what God thinks, and how what God thinks tends to reflect what I think. And so for that is sort of a perfect ritual. Is it partly because I'm doing something for someone who profoundly appreciates it because I appreciate it? Is that part of the reason that it's perfect?
Oh. No, I mean, I'm not being cute. I mean, the answer is no. I don't want to, unless, I mean, Justin, I don't know what else I should say. The answer is no.
Comment maybe for both of you. I'll direct it towards Justin. In your point about methodological teleology and your the way you brought in kind of a directionality within evolutionary psychology and reverse engineering, and it struck me that you were cozying up to evolutionary psychology more so than I thought you have in the past, in terms of wanting to maintain, a distinction between CSR and EvPsych, where you can certainly do good CSR without needing to kind of appeal to evolutionary psychology. And I thought that one of the reasons that you've kind of maintained that critical distance to some degree was because evolutionary psychology is just speculative in a way that CSR maybe isn't. And I thought, so just maybe comment on reverse engineering as a way of the critics would say, well, it's just kind of a bunch of people telling just so stories to kind of work their way backwards on an adaptationalist kind of view. And so, has something shifted, or what do you kind of?
No, I think you're right about my personal position on this. No, I'm with Bob. I typically distance myself away from this adaptationalism. What I was meaning to suggest there is, look, among the many things that people in CSR are doing, in an area that you might really feel uncomfortable, which is in the adaptationalist kind of area, right? Even there, this is a game that Christians can play too. Okay, and and we can think of it this way. Hanging out with evolutionary anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists of a certain sort, I was struck by how much they pay attention to just how well humans are tuned to the particular environments in which they live. They're made for this particular kind of environment, to do these particular kinds of things and do them well in this way and this way. well, that kind of rhetoric is very similar to the way that Christians talk.
It bugs me there too.
Well, it might. Okay. But what I was just trying to point out is there's a certain amount of resonance here.
Yeah.
Now, you're right, though. That's not the way that I choose to approach this science. I do try to stay away for just the reasons you're suggesting. So I was just trying to, well, here's an area where you might think there's a problem, and I'm not sure it's as much of a problem as you might think it is.
Sure.
As far as the directionality in evolution, actually, Schloss's point is not just with humans, actually, in groupishness and altruism. It's actually across both plant and animal species, he makes this argument. And you take a really long evolutionary view on these things. It's really pretty fascinating stuff. And I think for both he and Conway Morris, though, they want to say that these, at least on a certain level, are entirely explicable in terms of natural sorts of constraints in the environment and so forth.
Yes.
Well, if no one has a more interesting and substantive question, I was just curious. The bringing rituals to mind is a little fuzzy. It's been a couple of years. I'm just curious. Can you lay out what makes the baptism for the dead person?
Oh, golly, I thought about
it. It's a special agent ritual.
I should have put this in a slide because it's so much easier to do it with the illustrations. Okay, look, there are for those of you who've read the book, you know that we talk about two attractors in ritual space. What are your associations with ritual? I would guess they're one of two things. Ritual, the thing that we just do over and over and over again, and it's done so repetitively that at a point we actually have a phrase here in America, right? I mean, everyone in this room's heard this phrase, mindless ritual. Okay, and that is a kind of characterization of ritual. Ritual, by contrast, these are the two attractors. Ritual, by contrast, the really very unique, rare events that are incredibly, exhilarating and exciting because they're done rarely and they're just loaded with action. In our culture, weddings, best illustration. Okay, at least how they're done in lots of settings, most settings I know. Okay, there we are. Yeah. Well, you forgot the other attractor. Yeah. Okay, there you go. So very high sensory pageantry, but very low frequency for many of us, once in a lifetime, right? In contrast to very high frequency with low sensory pageantry. You go into the vestibule, put your hands in the water, and cross yourself, and you do that. Depending on how often you go to Mass, you could be doing that every day, easily, many times, in fact. Okay. There are problems, there are limitations, if you remember in the book, right? There are limitations with getting these things much more exciting. If you do things a lot and you make them exciting, it turns out, just to kind of give you the quick analogy, they're sort of like drugs. The more you do it, the more you want. You begin to habituate, and you need higher levels of excitement the next time. You need a bigger dose. And the point, of course, is that there are limits on how much sensory pageantry you can provide. There are social limits and there are individual limits. Individual limits, you can only feast for so long. And at a certain point, you're going to fall asleep. You can only provide feasts for so long before your community is going to run out of resources. Okay? So, indeed, what we argue in the book is Harvey Whitehouse's wonderful ethnography. Inside. I was thinking in the cult. That's not right. I knew that wasn't right. Yeah, inside the cult. describes a community in East New Britain Island that faces this. Okay, so what's the point about this? Well, Harvey argues, and I think quite correctly, this sort of stuff is real good for sort of getting certain things into place. Oftentimes practices, but he was particularly interested in, you can also do some of these rituals to get a lot of sort of substantive doctrines in people's head. This is the sort of stuff that people get inspired by. This is the sort of stuff that really leaves people, confirmation, baptism in the Anabaptist tradition, right? Full immersion baptism, you're an adult, wow. That's pretty exciting stuff. Okay. So now, what's the point? Well, the point is this. There are dangers over here, right? This is danger. This is habituation, and this is crashing through a ceiling that's going to lead you to catastrophe. Either individually you're going to fall asleep, go into a coma, or you're going to die. All right? So what would be really cool is if you could repeat these things, at least occasionally. But the problem is that, in the religion that we all know in this room best, namely in Christianity, you don't have any occasion for repeating these things. You don't get baptized more than once. Ideally, I suppose in the ideal picture, you only get married once under most circumstances, and so on. So these special agent rituals, where God's doing something to you and changing your status, this doesn't happen very often. So how can you repeat these things? Well, Harvey discovered one of these in the community he was looking at. That is to say, you can say, oh, we failed. We'll have to do it again. Okay? We didn't get it quite right, because in the group he was studying, the ritual was an excruciating ritual that the whole community was going through each evening. And the prospect was, the promise was, the ancestors are coming back tonight. Get up, you're staying at this ritual all night and they're not coming back. We must have made a mistake. There must be a certain moral failure in us, so we've got to do it again. Do it again. Well, it's a perfect example of what I meant by crashing. That community crashes. And Harvey has a wonderful account of it. Okay? So that's not so good. Failures. And besides, it ends up impugning some of the participants. Right? Either you're morally flawed, or your God is failing you, or whatever. So you don't like that. Okay, well, what else? How else can you do this? I'll make this quick. You can reverse them. Right? One of the points Lawson and I make is these rituals are not reversible. Those rituals are reversible. You can excommunicate people. You can divorce. You can have divorced marriages. You can defrock priests. These are the ones you can reverse. Well, if you reverse them, then you could do it over again. But other than Hollywood, at least on the marriage front, this doesn't really work so well. It's not so great. You don't want to have, because again, your God doesn't look so great, or there's got to be problems there. Okay, so how else can you do it? And what struck me and Tom was, you can also have people. You can just let people repeat them or have multiple degrees of them. Actually in Barth's book, there are 7 degrees of initiation for the male Bhaktaman. But it seems as though none of the sort of great world religions have come up with that one. So what is another option, and what's the option that doesn't carry any of the liabilities of the ones I've just discussed? And the answer is periodic repetition of these special agent rituals where people get to serve as substitutes for the patients of the rituals. And that is to say, in the baptism of the dead, about twice a year, sufficient, members of the LDS Church that are sufficiently in effect, have moved up through the stages. And again, that's kind of like degrees of initiation. get together and they go through baptism of the dead as substitutes for the dead. They do it as a cohort. They do it all day. They'll typically go through anywhere from 12 to up to maybe 20 full immersion baptisms periodically across the day. They are substituting for the dead people. That's the doctrine of the church. And that is that you can baptize the dead. Well, the dead aren't here. Somebody's got to substitute for them. You do this once every 6 months. Nobody gets habituated, right? Because it's still fairly infrequent. But it's more often than once in your lifetime. And it's a winner. So that's the story. And I don't know what Justin has been writing back here. Ritual substitution in special agent rituals. By the way, yeah, well, LDS, the LDS Church, part of the doctrine insists that there is one reference to this in the New Testament. I've forgotten which book it is. It's in one of Paul's letters, and he writes about it very briefly, just a couple verses in one of the letters.
Brings it all back, doesn't it, Adam?
So how about, so Bob, would thinking about, Justin wrote the moral of the story is that Christianity needs more initiations. Could repeatable initiations that happen not too often, but are repeatable, be things like going forward at a Billy Graham crusade? Is that a pretty good ritual?
Oh yeah, it turns out that I do not have the reference off. I at least had one sociologist of religion report to me that apparently there was at least one study done somewhere by sociologists that showed that in fact the majority of people who went up in Billy Graham crusades had gone up more than once over the course of their lifetimes. So sure, that kind of thing could be a kind of way of pulling that off. Sure.
We got a question here. Let me just add to this. There's empirical evidence to suggest, too, that, I'm only half joking that Christianity needs more initiations. There's some evidence that when there's a ritual cost for joining a community, those communities actually last longer and are characterized by more cohesion and cooperation. It's sort of easy in, easy out kind of principle. And maybe we've already seen that playing out with the seeker-sensitive movement, which has sort of crested and crashed, maybe because the entry costs were too low. Just a speculation.
I'm just wondering about church calendar and times of like Advent and Lent and things like that, and how reinstituting those, some traditions do it a lot and others don't do it at all, and wondering how that fits in with this idea, or if that's if it's along the same lines, or if it's completely separate. I was just interested.
It's an excellent question, and it's a very good question. This doesn't capture everything that folks typically regard as rituals, and these calendrical rituals, at least some of them don't. It's kind of hard to situate them, frankly, in this scheme, and I want to confess that straight up front. I think that they're not. I think that they probably are still ones that qualify in the nearer to the lower right. There are some, I shouldn't say near to the lower right, I should say lower. There are rituals that are here. There exist rituals there, and they exist in the world religions, the most famous of which would be the Hajj. It appears to be fairly high pageantry, but I actually think that's a bit of an artifact. But they have a huge amount of, so actually I don't think it is high pageantry. I think pilgrimages mostly aren't. Mostly they just keep you busy. You just do a bunch of stuff. You go someplace and you do something there, and then you go another place and you do something there, and you circle mountains and the Hajj, and you circle the Kaaba and all that sort of stuff. The reason they seem high pageantry is simply because we now live in a world where there are millions of Muslims. And when you do this with 1 million people, it's pretty exciting, right? But I mean, in 800, when you did it with 14 people, it was no big deal. Not 14, but say 1,400 over the whole year, you know. It was not as big a deal. That's what I think those calendrical rituals are like. But they really are, they require a fair amount of cultural support. And you don't, oh boy, I'm going to take a chance here. I'll just make this comment. I suspect that they're hard to sustain in non-literate cultures, other than just solstice type things, I guess. Those would be ones. I have to think about that a bit. But no, you've picked up on exactly one of the more troublesome cases that don't fit this scheme perfectly, and that obviously have me tap dancing.
We've got time for one, maybe two more questions.
Well, I'll make another comment. I'm just interested also in the fact of I realize that some things I'm just not sure about, and I wonder if maybe you'll say that you are right and I just don't know. But in the importance of, or like the stimulus of these actions that they did, because I mean, we have so many stimulus happening now that like everything is there, but I wonder if these communal things that came together were actually very much so exciting to the entire community that did them, more so than just a time spent or not, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, the calendrical rituals end up being a celebration of a community. And again, Justin's point about, earlier points made in talks today, right? I mean, about getting people to doing things synchronously likely will lead them to similar cognitive outcomes and similar emotional outcomes. And humans have there are a whole bunch of findings about this, including, among other things, in Emma's work, finding out that the rowers, Emma Cohen, who are doing the rowing at Oxford on the crew, right? If you row at one speed in a single scull by yourself, exactly the same stroke rate that these guys are stroking together in an 8, that when you're done and you test these guys on their pain thresholds, the guys in the 8 have much higher pain thresholds than the guy who did it by himself, even though they're doing exactly the same exercise. There's something about doing that with those other folks, you know?
Okay, we'll let the theologian have the last question.
Religion is an ancient human force. And it seems like CSR has spent a lot of energy trying to tap into that evolutionary, primitive, foundational experiences and operations that gave birth to religions and this kind of sustained religion. But at the same time, we're going through really, cultures of the world are going through unprecedented changes. Education levels, information overload. There was a way of kind of peer reviewing data as far as what was worth paying attention to and what wasn't. It's all falling apart. And I'm wondering who are the people who are actually trying to think through what are the implications, say, to your theory about ritual, as this ground shifts so fundamentally. So there's an example here that I can use that has some of the local people here, local theologians somewhat flaws. The Episcopalian Cathedral here has a Sunday Vesper service that 20-somethings, early 30s, show up in huge numbers, and they have for quite a few years. They have no other apparent connection to a religious tradition. The Episcopalians are terrified of studying it too closely for fear that they'll jinx it. But it's people who come for a very traditional Anglican Vesper service. They sit, they come early, they lay on the altar, then they leave, and you don't see them until the following Sunday. So, I'm wondering who's talking about that, if anyone is. And if that was perceived to be something that's going to somehow shift the theories, how do you go about trying to begin to create a research agenda to do that?
I don't think it shifts the theory at all. I think our theory, in fact, captures that exactly.
Yeah, I was going to go there too.
You do it.
Sorry, my mic is dead, battery died. I can stand next to you, and we can do this in harmony.
Yeah, right. I mean, this seems to be a growing trend in a lot of places, right? This sort of return to some of these more liturgical kinds of forms. And actually, I think it's of a piece with what we were just talking about. I mean, one of the things, so Bob is being modest here in his book that he and Tom note, is that especially Protestant Christianity is losing all of its rituals, in particular, its special agent rituals. They use a very particular circumscription of what constitutes a religious ritual. And looking very seriously at that circumscription, in a lot of Protestant churches, you're probably down to maybe 2 that most people will participate in, and sort of maybe a third. Weddings is one that most people, baptism. And then the maybe a third is ordination. And beyond that, you pretty much don't have any left. Because even, maybe that's just rituals, period. There are very few that fit the form that well. But it's particularly these special agent rituals. So you think that in a lot of traditions, you've got lots of levels of initiation, coming of age sorts of things that are also community-wide. So this is part of my interest in adolescent development and so forth in my new center. You know, in a lot of places, in fact, probably most cultures, you marked off when people become adults. Ritually. It's an unchangeable special agent ritual that suddenly, before the gods and the community, everybody knows this person has new status in their community that's immutable, unless they go through another ritual that moves them up the next step, right? Those are gone. We used to have those as part of high schools, right? Baccalaureate services and things like that. High school graduations were religious rituals, officiated. They were special agent rituals. Those are gone. Increasingly, in the American context, you have fewer and fewer rituals, and maybe particularly these special agent rituals. And so that people are looking for something more motivating in high Anglican and Catholic types of church services is not surprising on their theory, I don't think, because they're these sort of motivational needs that need to be kicked in. But now you can go.
Yeah, I would also add that back when we wrote the book, I mean, what was so striking, of course, was the comparative, gradual, but nonetheless pretty steady decline of the standard Protestant denominations and the rise of evangelical, Pentecostal, independent settings that had much more animated rituals. I mean, what most people who live in North America and certain areas in Northern Europe maybe don't understand is that they live in ritually impoverished cultures, comparatively speaking. And not only is it the case that there are fewer of those, but one of the things that we talked about is, at least in lots of the Protestant settings, is that the sensory pageantry levels have been declining, right? I mean, even just the difference about baptism, I mean, think about that. But I mean, in short, you know, they're
relative sensory pageantry levels in these versus ordinary life or other kinds of things as well. So I don't know. There's some resources here maybe that bear on these questions. Or we just are good at making stuff up. No, but it's 2002, right? So it's